Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to welcome you to the first of our series of Spark Change for Justice, a webinar series that will be discussing racial justice, how the COVID pandemic has both revealed and exacerbated systems that harm communities of color, and to highlight the extraordinary work that's happening right here in Brooklyn with our grantee partners. So welcome. Before we get started, I do just want to do a moment of silence as a very sad statistic emerged yesterday, which is the world has hit 1 million fatalities due to COVID. So we're just going to do a moment of silence. Thank you. So I just want to start first by saying that I need to acknowledge our really generous sponsors who have generously sponsored this video series. They are National Grid, Santander, and Take-Two Interactive Software, which allows us to bring these conversations with experts and incredible notables in the space throughout this fall. Please be sure to visit our website, brooklyncommunityfoundation.org, to see what else is coming up, and I'll discuss that in more detail a little later on. Few notes about today's program. We are going to be hearing from, we're just so honored and excited about this. We're going to be hearing from Brooklyn native Hakeem Jeffries, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and CNN, MSNBC political commentator Aisha Mills. Aisha is also an esteemed board member of Brooklyn Community Foundation. Quick note, while Congressman Jeffries is obviously very busy, just a quick review of headlines would tell you kind of what's happening right now. So he is running a little late, and we expect Aisha shortly. She's having a little bit of a power outage problem, such as, I guess, our virtual world now where we're so dependent on technology. But they will be discussing the critical impacts and interplay of the upcoming election, Black political power, the 2020 census, and the impact of COVID-19 on Brooklyn's communities. Aisha is a seasoned political strategist and social impact advisor. She has led and won campaigns that built political power for women, people of color, LGBTQ people for close to 20 years. A nationally respected voice on progressive policy and politics, Aisha appears regularly on national news networks and has published dozens of policy reports and political and cultural analyses about the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. She's been recognized as one of Out 100 influencers by Out Magazine, The Roots 100 Most Influential African Americans, and Advocate Magazine's 40 Under 40 list of exemplary LGBTQ leaders. We are so delighted always to have her on our board, and also delighted that she'll be joining us today. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries represents the 8th Congressional District of New York, which encompasses large parts of Brooklyn and a section of Queens. Serving his 4th term in the United States Congress, Representative Jeffries is a member of the House Judiciary Committee and House Budget Committee. Representative Jeffries is chairman of the House Democratic Caucus and the 5th highest ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives. He's also the former whip of the Congressional Black Caucus and previously co-chaired the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, where he helped develop the For the People agenda. Aisha, I'm so happy to see you. I'm going to discuss the foundation a little.
Yes.
I'm so glad you were able to overcome technical difficulties. So before we get into conversation, there's so much to discuss. Even last night, there's news about the census, so a lot to catch up on and discuss. And we also, I just want to say, we welcome questions. I'll do that in a minute with all of you. But first, I just want to say, for some of you who may be new to the foundation and have signed on this webinar, of course, for our esteemed speakers, I just want to do a little review about what Brooklyn Community Foundation is. We were founded in 2009 as the first and only public foundation dedicated to New York's largest borough, and in fact, as we all know, the fourth largest city in the country, were we a city. We are a bridge between donors and nonprofits to spark lasting social change. And I want to point out that all of our work and all of our operations are deeply rooted in an explicit commitment to racial justice. Today, by today, we have granted more than $50 million to vital organizations, $50 million in 10 years to vital organizations across this borough. A little bit about our COVID response fund. In early March, and actually I would like to say really late February, the board stepped up very quickly and said, this is going to come hard on Brooklyn, given our demographics, and we need to act. So really as early as late February, long before many others, the board said, we're going to do two things. We are going to increase our drawdown from our endowment to meet this crisis. And we're also going to commit personally and generously to creating a fund. So the COVID-19 Response Fund was among the very first in the country to prioritize support, and the only one that we know of right now, to prioritize support for BIPOC communities in the first phase of our fund. So I really would like to say, first of all, thank you to the, are you ready for this? 1,600 donors who gave to this fund. To date, we have raised $3.9 million. And if this isn't a sign that Brooklynites really know how to fight hard, I can't think of another great example. Just in the first 16 weeks, when we were really in a very dire and dramatic part of this pandemic, we were able to get $3.3 million out the door to over 420 organizations. And we did these grants on a weekly basis. So our goal with this fund was make it as easy as possible on these grantees. We need to get money into the community as quickly as possible. And my phenomenal staff was processing requests for support every 7 days. And we are incredibly proud, and this covered food and PPE, financial support for low-wage workers, social services for older adults and immigrants, and much more. I welcome you to go to our website and look up the Brooklyn COVID Response Fund. The next phase of the fund will kick off in October with a community engagement process where we are going to go back to the community leaders and community residents that have been most impacted by this pandemic and learn from them what is the biggest need going forward, because we all know this pandemic is still raging, and we also know that the long-term impact, especially on people of color in Brooklyn, is going to be profound and long-lasting. So we are going to speak to those who know best, which are the community leaders and the residents who are going to tell us these are our priorities. And with that information, we will move in to phase 2 of the Brooklyn COVID Response Fund. Finally, I just want to say about that fund and all donations that come into the foundation, 100% of every dollar donated goes right back out to the community in Brooklyn. I'll just say that again in case anyone missed it, which is that every dollar donated goes right back out to communities, and almost entirely communities of color in Brooklyn. As a quick reminder, if you would like your questions answered, please type into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I have phenomenal staff members back there, if you will, looking at the questions, and we're going to do our very best to answer whatever questions you have. We also have closed caption available. Please look at the bottom of your screen to turn those on by clicking the arrow closed caption and selecting show subtitle. Throughout the webinar, you can look back at what has been said by clicking on view full transcript or just the size of the captions. We hope that this will help you all keep track of what's being discussed, because it's going to be a lively conversation, I think. So with that, I want to turn it over to Aisha. Aisha, good morning. And why don't we start with just a couple of questions. I mentioned last night breaking news about the census. Just let me do a quick review on the census and why the census is so critical to us as a foundation and to us as a borough, which is that 10 years ago, Brooklyn had the lowest count of any county in New York State and among the lowest counts in the country. And this is particularly tragic because, of course, about 70% of the population of Brooklyn are low-income people of color. And so this is really a further marginalization of access to federal funding, access to representation. So over a year and a half ago, the foundation decided they were going to make it a priority to really focus on the census. This is about democracy. This is about civil rights. This is about voice and agency. And we partnered with Brooklyn Borough Hall, and we have been doing a lot of advocacy, a lot of op-eds, and we also heavily lobbied the state to please be as generous as possible this time around so it doesn't happen again. And as you all know, the state, in fact, committed an enormous amount of money, over $1 million to this effort, but sadly, COVID happened, and we just thought, we're not gonna be able to do anything. And yet, happily, in early August, the state was able to commit almost $500,000. And in partnership with Borough Hall, the foundation has been getting that money out as quickly as possible to leaders, community leaders, to try to increase the count. And this is absolutely critical for any number of reasons. However, of course, the news impacts this. The bad news was they moved the deadline from October 31st to September 30th, the current administration. The good news was a judge knocked that down and put it back to October 31st. So we were happy that our community groups were indeed gonna have until October 31st. And then sadly, just last night, Wilbur Ross announced that no, actually he's gonna close the census on October 3rd. This gravely impacts communities in Brooklyn and in the country. So Aisha, I'm just gonna start off there, but say what you want.
Well, thank you so much, Cecilia. And I have to say that I am just so proud of this foundation, the work that you have done. The entire staff is amazing. I am honored to sit on the board of the Brooklyn Community Foundation. And just to those who are watching, I want you all to know that we had a really great board meeting Friday morning, talking about how certainly tragic the current circumstances are. We're going to get into that with the congressman. But in the midst of so much of the things that are unknown and so much stress and strain on our community, I'm just so proud of the way that the team, which is not that large, our staff, really rallied, raised a ton of money, and has been deploying it out into the community to really meet the day-to-day needs of people. So thank you for all of your work, and we really appreciate it, and Brooklyn is certainly better off because of it. What comes up for me right now as we have this conversation, and I know we're having it through a community lens, is that in my 20-something years in politics, I've always reminded people that all politics are local. Everything is local and about the local impact on real people. But if you were to watch the news, there's so much of a disconnect there between the national fervor around Donald Trump and his taxes, and certainly the election that's coming up, and all the other scandalous things that make sometimes watching the news feel like reality television rather than real people. So today's conversation I'm excited about, because with Congressman Jeffries, we're gonna really connect those dots and break down what's happening in our communities, how we're reacting, responding to it, what our needs are, and how that's directly tethered to this election cycle, and certainly the presidential, and why we all need to pay attention and why it matters. An interesting fun fact, that I didn't know until I actually started getting involved with the Brooklyn Community Foundation is that we talk so much about our commitment to racial justice and are really excited to do work in a way that is authentic and reflects the communities that we serve. And it's not just because it's lip service. When Cecilia came on board years ago and said, wait a minute, we need to think about this and think about who our community really is, it was because Brooklyn is home to the largest Black population in North America, because we are very much a Black community and a highly immigrant community and a brown community. And so when we think about BIPOC communities, we talk about diversity. It's not just lip service because it's the sexy thing to do or because Black Lives Matter sounds good. It's because Black lives absolutely matter in our communities, and we're being extremely responsive to them. And so Congressman Jeffries will kind of talk to us a little bit about his perspective on these things. But I just wanted to say, just in closing to my opening, that we are living in such critical time right now. And we don't have a ton of time on this call, but we're going to talk deeply about COVID and how COVID has devastated our borough, and what the response looked like, and what nationally should be being done to kind of help us stem that tide. We're also going to talk about the census. And, you know, the census isn't the sexiest thing all the time for people. They're like, oh, why are we talking about this? But just as Cecilia just said, our money that is allocated through the federal government is directly tied to how many people are counted in our communities. And all of that gets reflected in our political representation or not. And so that's important. And it's important right now because we're in a climate where there is going to be a lot of missed opportunities of people participating, some intentional, it's a design strategy, others just because the climate right now, people are scared to even answer the door, come out of their home. So we're going to talk about that. And then the last thing is that we are clearly right now in the morning of the first presidential debate. So we want to hear from our congressman, who is also, by the way, the number 3 ranking Democrat in the United States, the House of Representatives. We want to hear from him about what should be said, what to expect on the horizon, some of the policy ideas that he cares about and is working on, and what to look for tonight. So,
Aisha, thank you so much. Such a great summation of what we're going to do. I'd like to welcome Congressman Jeffries to the conversation, and I'm going to let the two of you speak to talk about what's happening in Brooklyn, what's happening in the world. Congressman, are you able to turn on your video and microphone?
Hi there. He will be here very, very shortly.
Okay, no problem at all. Not a problem.
Cool. He has a lot of things going on. I can only imagine.
I just can't. I actually can't even imagine it.
And so I just want to echo, Cecilia, for everybody who's tuned in. I am going to, as I have the conversation with the congressman, I'm also going to try to moderate some questions that you might have. So do put those in the Q&A. I am looking at them, and we'll try to get through some of those as we get a little closer to the end.
Okay. So I'm going to take my leave. Unless, Aisha, you have any questions for me about what we're doing right now, about what's happening right now?
No, but I do think it's always a great opportunity to just give another plug for the foundation, and certainly our Racial Justice Fund and work and how we're allocating the resources. But while we may have a beautiful community in Brooklyn that rallied and responded in the wake of the COVID crisis, what's important, I think, Cecilia, is if you kind of remind us why we need to keep that momentum and to not kind of say, oh, well, we did good, and then go back to, you know, not really paying as much attention. So
Aisha, I think that's a great question. And I just want to go backwards a little, which is that actually, as Aisha touched on, we actually established our Racial Justice Equity Fund 6 years ago. And I'm saying that because, as you had mentioned, we are a community that needs to address that issue. So we're still in it. We're deeply in it. We're not changing that. But I have had a lot of donors approach me, and I just want to finish with this saying, I want to work towards racial justice. I'm engaged, and we do have a racial equity fund. We welcome donations to the racial equity fund. This is the core of the work that we do. So I would just do a plug for that. We're here for the long term. and our engagement with the community is authentic. And so we welcome your generosity and your commitment. Congressman Jeffries, welcome. We know you're so busy and we're just so grateful
Good morning.
for you taking the time.
Sorry about the delay. Great to be on.
Not a problem at all. I'm actually going to leave you two wizards to have a fantastic conversation. I'm so excited to hear you. And again, thank you so much, Congressman. We're just really honored to have you here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
That we are. And everybody, I am so excited to be joined by my favorite congressman. Of course, I'm biased. We all should be. Go Brooklyn. Welcome. Thank you. There's a lot of things we want to chat about, Congressman Jeffries, but I think I would like to start by just giving you a moment. It has been completely chaotic the last 6 months. I would suggest since 2017, the inauguration of Donald Trump. Nonetheless, it has been completely chaotic in Brooklyn because of COVID over the last 6 months, and so many other things. So I just want to know, how are you doing, and how are you splitting your time in terms of trying to focus on all the issues? What are like the 3 things that you're working on right now?
Well, great to be with you, and great to be joined by so many extraordinary people from throughout Brooklyn. And of course, so thankful for the Brooklyn Community Foundation for all that you have done and continue to do on behalf of our great borough. These have certainly been challenging times, as we've dealt with both the twin crisis of, a public health situation, emergency, as well as an economic crisis connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know there's been a lot of pain and suffering and death connected to that pandemic that we personally experienced in Brooklyn, and that people throughout the country and the world have also experienced. So that, has been a primary focus, both in terms of on the ground engagement in making sure that we do all that we can to protect the health, safety, and well-being of the people that I'm privileged to represent. And many of those neighborhoods, Aisha, as you know, were hit extremely hard. And at the same time, working in Washington to try to ensure that we get the most meaningful possible congressional intervention that addresses the moment. And while we were able to act in a bipartisan way 4 times earlier this year, since House Democrats passed the HEROES Act on May 15th, over 130 days ago, we haven't been able to get much movement, much interest from the president and the Republicans in doing anything further. And that's been a great disappointment, though we are continuing to work and are hopeful this week that we may be able to arrive at an agreement to address the continuing dynamics associated with the pandemic. That's just on COVID-19. And of course, there are a whole host of other challenges that we're experiencing connected to racial justice and the continuing issues with respect to housing displacement that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So no shortage of business to do, but it's a privilege to be able to work on behalf of the people to do it.
Well, thank you for your work. One of the numbers that just haunts me is 6,000. We've lost 6,000 people in Brooklyn to COVID. And at one point, we had the highest number of deaths of any county in the country early on during COVID. And I think now we're like 3rd, only behind Queens and LA County. And Brooklyn is clearly Black. So there's a disproportionate impact there on people of color who are really affected by, and, we're losing to this pandemic, and it's raging on. And to your point, it doesn't seem like some people in Washington are really connecting to the pain that we're feeling in our communities. And I just wonder if you could, for the folks who are listening right now, who perhaps don't know what some of the federal measures are that could come into our community and help us stem this tide, if you could just share a little bit about what's already been happening and what is out there that we're waiting for with regards to the HEROES Act that could help either economically or with regards to healthcare, et cetera.
Yeah, no, thank you. What we've said needs to be done in terms of addressing the crisis, and we acted in May because at that point in time, we knew that it was not over. In fact, in many cases, it was just getting started, both as it relates to the public health side of the crisis and the economic side of the crisis. And so we extended the emergency unemployment insurance benefit of $600 per week into the early part of next year, because we feel like that's the appropriate thing to do when you still have tens of millions of people across the country who are unemployed. We authorized another round of direct stimulus payment to everyday Americans. Most families of 5 are eligible to receive $6,000 per family. That'll be $1,200 per person, both adults and up to 3 children. We authorized within the HEROES Act $185 billion in assistance for renters who are struggling to pay their rent, as well as for homeowners, out of recognition that we have to step in on behalf of the American people. Shelter is one of the most important aspects of day-to-day life. And to have that jeopardized is destabilizing for families, communities, of course, our city, and indeed the nation. We also have set aside approximately $1 trillion for state and local stabilization, out of recognition that if we allow the New York City budget, for instance, to completely collapse, or the New York State budget to collapse, that the people who will get hurt the most are already the most vulnerable. Because when these budgets are slashed, the result is that you cut public education, public health, public housing, public transportation, public safety, the basic provision of the public good, and those communities that are most vulnerable will be hit the hardest. And so those sort of are the core pillars, in addition to additional funding for testing, tracing, and treatment, as well as assistance for food insecurity. I've been disheartened by the amount of people who are on food lines throughout the borough and the city and the country. And we as a Congress should step in to make sure that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, people aren't going hungry.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's 69% of the people who have lost jobs in Brooklyn are also people of color, who are low-wage workers, most of them making less than $60,000 a year, which makes me think so much about the economic impact, because we already have such a structurally skewed economic system in this country anyway, of who those frontline workers are that are putting themselves at risk to maintain a lot of the systems you're talking about. We need to shore up financially. And then I think about the kind of personal and human toll that takes too. I wonder, Congressman, because you, just throughout your career, have always been thoughtful about some of the structural barriers to inequality and how our systems are, really need to be reformed in order to address some of these issues. COVID exacerbated a lot of the health disparities that we already knew were there, the poverty issues that we already knew were there. And I wonder, from your perch as a significant leader in the caucus, in the Democratic caucus, could you share with us a little insight on how you all might be thinking about this moment as an opportunity to perhaps push the envelope further to make some of the changes, offer some of the supports that we know have been really underpinning the issues that we see today that COVID just exacerbated?
Yeah, no, it's a very important observation. And prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the economic realities that had shocked those of us who, are studying these issues and reviewing surveys was that half the American people reported that they couldn't afford a sudden, unexpected $400 expense. This was in the midst of a thriving economy. And now you've got the onset of a pandemic, a recession, and in some cases, depression-like conditions where people have lost employment, lost their livelihoods, and were already in a very vulnerable state. And that situation, of course, is exacerbated within the African American community. It's often said when when America catches a cold, the African American community gets the flu. Can you imagine what happens when America catches a pandemic? That's what we're seeing right now. And it's because of those underlying structural inequalities that have existed. And so this has presented an opportunity to try to level the playing field for everyone, I think in three key areas: access to job opportunities, the pathway being both, the traditional formal education and career and technical education into job opportunities that provide a pathway into the middle class. Housing, and there's been historic discrimination, redlining, the denial of the opportunity to own a home, the targeting of communities of color in many different ways, as had occurred in advance of the Great Recession of 2008, and then access to entrepreneurial opportunities so that there is a ability for people who have an idea but want to transform that idea into a business, that the lack of access to capital, the structural barriers that exist to that level of entrepreneurship are real. It's real out in Silicon Valley. It's real here in New York City. It's real throughout the country. And so I think there's a great interest, particularly if we have what I call a triangular alignment of values on January 20th with the House, the Senate, and the presidency, to really tackle these issues in a meaningful way.
Oh, I love this triangular alignment. Let's align it, Congressman. I want to just grab one of the questions out of the Q&A because it touched on something you just said, and we're going to get into, the climate that we're in and the election that's coming and what this might mean for us. One question that came from Carol Lamberg was specifically about a housing policy. You just mentioned some kind of incentives to bridge the gap around home ownership. I know that presidential candidate Biden has a plan around housing. Could you speak a little bit more to maybe your thoughts about the proposed housing plan, what your housing plan you're working on might be, and how that's different from every single political cycle? There is banter about housing and home ownership, and it doesn't really go very far.
Yeah, the challenge, of course, is, in Brooklyn, and I've talked a lot with Alan Fishman and other, great civic leaders about this, is that the density of New York City, doesn't allow for the same type of home ownership opportunities that you might see in other parts of the country, just because of the limitations that we confront as it relates to land. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be creative, both on the rental side in terms of creating and preserving as much affordable housing as possible, and still, looking into models that were very successful in the past, such as the Mitchell-Lama home ownership models that were designed to provide ownership opportunities to working class New Yorkers, moderate income New Yorkers, and middle class New Yorkers, because that still really is the key, both for a sustainable middle class lifestyle, as well as being able to transfer generational wealth. And because African Americans, certainly in Brooklyn and New York City, are disproportionately underrepresented as it relates to home ownership within our communities, we don't have that same level of wealth transfer available to us from one generation to the next. And you don't have the ability to utilize a growing asset in terms of what you own to be able to do other things, such as refinance, to be able to make investments in your child's education, for instance, to give them an opportunity to go pursue a higher degree or beyond. in order to advance themselves. So there's real limitations. So I think there's a great currency in Joe Biden putting a focus on home ownership within the affordable housing context, because that really is central to the American dream. And while we've got challenges in New York in terms of the traditional home with a picket fence and a big yard, though there are many neighborhoods, even some that I represent in Canarsie or in South Brooklyn, where you actually have that type of home ownership opportunity. And it's a wonderful thing. We also have to start thinking about how to create these opportunities in the context of the limitations that we have in terms of space, and looking back at models like the Mitchell-Lama ones that were previously successful for moderate income New Yorkers.
So I'm going to put you on the spot now, and you have said a lot of things that I agree with about who the guy who is perhaps our most notorious New Yorker at this point, Donald Trump. And I'm thinking about wealth generation and, how we figure out how we can help people who are just honest working people who pay their taxes to get a hold of the American dream as it has been so defined. But one of the structural barriers to that is that there is a whole class level where the wealthiest folks are able to game the system through a lot of federal incentives that perpetuate that. That make it difficult to compete, make it difficult to access real estate, make it difficult to fund and, to afford the taxes, et cetera. And so I wonder, as the political conversation is happening right now, we got a debate going down tonight. People are thinking about what might really motivate them around voting in general in November. And it always comes back to the pocketbook, we say, right? When we're thinking about voter engagement, how people's finances are doing, if they're able to put food on the table, if they're able to invest money, transfer wealth, all of those things really affect people, I believe, political interest, attitudes, and engagement. And knowing that our system is so skewed, I wonder how you kind of, in your leadership position, are trying to bridge that gap and push back against the system that is working better for others than it is for, the people that most of the people that you represent, frankly.
Well, we can have an economy that works for everyday Americans, or we can have an economy that works for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. And unfortunately, what we've seen from the current occupant at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is that he's primarily concerned with his own advancement, his own personal enrichment, as well as the enrichment of his friends and buddies and those who spend time with him at Bedminster or down in Mar-a-Lago. And I think Exhibit A for that is that his primary achievement, his signature piece of legislation, was the GOP tax scam, which was passed in 2017, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%, at a time when there was no justification for using the tax code in that fashion and saddling our children with approximately $2 trillion worth of debt. And now, when you've got everyday Americans dying, struggling, being infected by the coronavirus, uncertain as to how they're going to pay the rent or their mortgage, now all of a sudden they want to lecture us again about fiscal responsibility. And so, we have to reorient our approach. And my view has generally been, we should be focused on how do you create prosperity in every single zip code. We're not trying to take it away from anybody. We just want to give every single American the fairest shot possible to live a comfortable life consistent with that fundamental American contract, which is if you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to provide a comfortable living for yourself and for your family. And that fundamental contract has been broken in part because of the combination of a wide variety of factors, the globalization of the economy, the outsourcing of good paying American jobs, some poorly negotiated trade deals by both Democrats and Republicans, the dramatic decline in unionization that has taken place, over the last several decades. And of course, the rise of automation, which has some positive benefits for consumers, but also has ripped away a lot of job opportunities that traditionally have been a pathway into the middle class. So it's a combination of structural factors that have conspired against working class Americans, the middle class, and those who aspire to be part of it, that we have to address with the fierce urgency of now. And I'm hopeful that under different leadership, we'll see that take place.
So clearly we've got an opportunity to have different leadership very soon. We're just over 30 days at this point. It's coming up on us, the November election. So I want to talk a little politics. And the first thing that I'd like for you to share with everyone, there's been so much about how we're going to be able to vote in this election cycle. Every state is doing something different. Every jurisdiction is issuing different kind of warnings, approaches, standards to showing up at the polls versus mailing in a ballot versus this and that. New York, surprisingly to me, is actually a little more complicated to be able to mail in your ballot than maybe other states. And so I would like you to set the record straight for all of us. How are we voting, early voting and otherwise, for this November election? Give us the 101 on that. What should we all prepare to do right now in order to make sure that our votes happen and that they're counted?
Well, the most important thing, I think, as Michelle Obama said, have a plan. And you've got three options. You can either vote by mail, vote from home. You have to, of course, request an absentee ballot. That absentee ballot will then be sent to your home. You can then fill it out and send it back and or drop it off at the Board of Elections. I believe 245 Adams Street is the site for us in Brooklyn, in downtown Brooklyn. So that's one lane you can go down. Early voting is a different lane. And I think by mid-October, this will be announced, but you'll be able to vote for at least 10 consecutive days and at least 2 previous weekends prior to November 3rd at an early voting location. And I think that's an important way to go. And you can vote in person, but you can avoid some of the crowds if you choose not to go down the third lane, which is, of course, voting on November 3rd with the polls open at 6 and closing at 9. And so I think the first thing is to just come to a decision as to what lane you want to travel down, and then have a plan for making sure that. The good news is that even if you decide, as was the case in my household, that it doesn't seem feasible to be able to vote by mail because I don't think I got a form to request a ballot until after the primary. This is the sitting member of Congress. And so, part of the challenge we've got is at the Board of Elections, they make the New York Knicks look competent sometimes. And so that's a bit of a challenge. But we are trying to provide them and entities throughout the country with the resources necessary to be able to carry out safe voting in a pandemic. We previously, during the CARES Act, allocated $400 million to states and municipalities in the context of election security grants. We are fighting for hundreds of millions of dollars more. No surprise, the Republicans are trying to stop it from happening. We continue to make the point that in a pandemic, no American should have to choose between their constitutional right to vote on the one hand and their health, safety, and well-being on the other, which is why we want to make these 3 lanes available in as robust a fashion as possible: voting from home or early voting and or sufficient polling sites on election day so that you don't have lines that are out of control and wait times that are out of control. And, thankfully, it looks like the Barclays Center, as will be the case with other NBA arenas across the country, will be available to help accommodate that.
All right, y'all heard the congressman. You can actually go in person to cast your vote during early voting or on election day, in addition to being able to request a mail-in ballot. That's a two-step process. If you want to do it from home and mail it in, you got to request it, do that form, then they're going to send it to you, then you got to fill out the ballot, then you got to send that back. So do it and just help to educate the people around you, because I know that a lot of folks are like, oh, I don't know what to do. I'm hearing things on the news that say that I can't go to the polls, and it's a little bit confusing. But in New York and Brooklyn, we can absolutely go there and show up. So thank you for that, Congressman. And I want to, at the Brooklyn Community Foundation, we are very focused on structural change. We know that we can't just throw $1 million at something, put a Band-Aid on it and think, look at us, it's going to go away now, we fixed the problem. And so as partners with you from a community level of thinking about where we can be doing our work, what policies, what practices, what provisions we should really be focused on investing in, trying to change, and just encouraging people to advocate around. Do you have, kind of your hit list of the policy issues that make sense for us in Brooklyn to be focusing on, that we can really get to some of this structural change?
Well, housing continues to be an incredibly critical concern. We've seen explosive growth in New York City over the last decade or so. That's a good thing. People want to be here. But of course, that's created a tremendous amount of pressure on the housing, where the supply of affordable housing is greatly exceeded by the demand. And since the demand is so much higher than the supply that's available, that creates cost pressures that really price moderate income families or low income families or working families out of the market. And part of our strength in Brooklyn is diversity. I mean, this is the borough that has given the world Shirley Chisholm, Jackie Robinson, Junior's Cheesecake, Coney Island, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the notorious B.I.G. I mean, that's just a snapshot of what we've represented: our intellectual, our athletic, our artistic, our racial, our religious diversity, our cultural diversity. And that's what has made us great, as a borough. That's what's made us a place where people want to come from all across the world. And so I think we have to be intentional about preserving that in the face of the market forces that are wiping out, the diversity in historically colorful neighborhoods in terms of people from all different parts of the world, all different races, all different regions, and we really are at risk of losing that. And so I think housing, of course, will always be a critical issue. It's the number one thing that I hear from people when I'm on the streets in Brooklyn and back at home. And the other thing that I think may make some sense to focus on in the context of the pandemic is that a lot of our small businesses have been hit incredibly hard. And across the country, more than 100,000 have permanently closed. Many of them in Brooklyn adversely impacted. And these commercial corridors in neighborhoods, whether it's Brighton Avenue, Brighton Beach Avenue, Coney Island Avenue, Church Avenue, Nostrand Avenue, Pitkin Avenue, Fulton Street, of course. I think finding ways to make sure that we lift up these commercial corridors will also be incredibly important as we try to emerge from this pandemic.
All right, we got our marching orders. Speak to, again, the last question on kind of this election cycle. We know that you are busy doing, the lion's share of the work for us up in Washington and thinking about the federal perspective, but you also started locally. You started in the state legislature, and you get that the down ballot races really matter too. So we're focused on a presidential for November, but we got a lot going on Brooklyn generally. So can you just, talk to people as we think about, and next year is going to be a big election year for us in 2021, et cetera. But can you just, give people a little something to think about on why as the presidential is important, we also should really think about support and stay connected to our local politics and down ballot races.
Yeah, well, I think it's incredibly important at every level of government to make sure that you are participating in our democracy and electing people who share your values. And what I've been saying in particular to a lot of young folks in a moment of great turmoil, I used to be one of those young folks. I'm going through a midlife crisis right now. I don't know what's happened, how the time has gone by so quickly. But what I've been saying to a lot of young folks who've been out in the streets protesting is that the two pillars of our democracy are, protesting and anchored in freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, the right to peacefully protest and petition your government for change, as well as voting. Those are the twin pillars. And that if you just protest but aren't participating at every level of government, city, state, federal, then it's much less likely that the thing will actually be addressed if you're not putting people into office who share your values. Whereas conversely, if you're participating in our democracy at every level and you're sending people to City Hall or to Albany or to Washington or to the DA's office, for instance, who share your values, then it's much more likely that your cries for change are going to be heard. And that's on every issue, not just dealing with, the police community relationship, which is a big challenge and something that we're working hard to address and overcome, but on every issue. And you can have a greater impact, many would argue, in a local election because the electorate is much smaller than in some of these national elections.
So that point on participation is exactly the note that we want to end on this conversation. Participation with regards to the census. It was said earlier, Cecilia kind of walked us through how 10 years ago, Brooklyn had one of the lowest response rates in the country. And that is consequential for a lot of reasons. And you are, I know, thinking about that too, because what will happen if we don't have a good response rate, worst case scenario, we could end up losing a representative. But certainly the things that could happen is that we won't be allocated the appropriate amount of federal funding that we're due for all the people who are paying taxes and should get that money kind of coming back to support our communities. And so I would love for you to speak a little bit about that. COVID has also made it really trying to go out and to have people actually encouraging folks to fill out their census forms. And then just, was it last night? It turns out that the feds, the administration, is still going to keep the same census deadline and cut that off at the beginning of October. So we're not even seeing an expanded window to try to make sure we're doing good with our count. So could you speak to us about, what all is happening with the census and your take on why this is so important for Brooklyn?
Well, an incredibly important issue to end on. I'm thankful for the work that Cecilia, the Brooklyn Community Foundation, so many partners across the borough have engaged in to try to make sure that we get a full and accurate count. There is a reason why Donald Trump and his administration are doing everything possible to try to undermine a fair and accurate count. It's because they understand that the stakes are incredibly high and long lasting, both as it relates to legislative representation, but perhaps more significantly, the allocation of federal resources, which in many cases is based on population. And so if we have an undercount in Brooklyn and throughout New York City, then we are going to be underrepresented in terms of our fair share of resources. That means for public education, That means for affordable housing. That means for infrastructure, transportation, bridges, roads, and tunnels. That means for homeland security grants. That means for health care. It's across the board. It affects every single facet of your life. And that's why the Trump administration has been so diabolical in their scheming. I mean, you know, they initially, of course, tried to put a citizenship question into the survey, even though the Constitution is very clear, count every single person, not every single citizen. And these were well-educated framers of the Constitution. If they wanted to use the word citizen, they could have. They did it in other places, like you've got to be a citizen to run for president. Now, you know, so that was rejected. And then, you know, he's going through the courts now to say, well, we should only count documented people. We should count undocumented people. The courts have rejected that. You know, they are trying to accelerate the date, and that's why we keep toggling back between September 30th and October 31st, and ultimately it's going to have to get resolved by the courts and maybe the Supreme Court. And again, it's all designed to create a climate where people are reticent to participate, particularly if you're a mixed status family, or and that's presented a lot of challenges in a diverse place like Brooklyn. Challenges in, you know, in heavily Latino areas, challenges in heavily Caribbean American areas, even challenges in Brown, which I represent in Southern Brooklyn, where the count is low. And it's a heavily immigrant community. And so we're working as hard as we can to turn the situation around. The good news is, because of the all hands on deck effort over the last few weeks, our numbers are moving north of where they were in 2010. And that's a good thing. If we get another month, we'll be even better. But let's assume that we've got until tomorrow. And I know all of us are going to continue to do everything that we can. Takes only about 10 minutes. There are only about 10 questions, but it leads to 10 years of our fair share of federal resources and representation. That's a pretty good deal. 10,
Indeed.
10, and 10. That's a pretty good deal.
Indeed it is. Well, thank you, Congressman, for all of your work. We've got some people in the chat, one of them also a Binghamton alum, who are asking, you know, quick lightning round from you. What can we all do today to support everything you've talked about and to get involved and to make a meeting come this election cycle?
Well, I think the most important thing is to obviously make the commitment that you are going to vote and find 4 other people to do the same. So that not only do you have a plan, but you have a plan for 4 other people to vote. And it doesn't have to be in Brooklyn. It doesn't have to be in New York City, because you probably know people, if you were to think about it, in a swing state like Pennsylvania or Michigan or North Carolina or Wisconsin, certainly Florida, with all the ex-New Yorkers that are down in Florida. Make the commitment that you're going to participate, and you're going to ensure that 4 or 5 other people do the same. It's like the voting bucket challenge. I mean, if we can do it for other things, good causes, we can do it in terms of voting. And if we all do our part, that's going to exponentially lead to a high level of civic participation and the best possible outcome for our community, our city, and our country.
We're on it. Thank you so much for your time, Representative Jeffries. We know you're busy. Thank you so much for spending time with us, and we'll keep doing our good work to support all of your good work. So we appreciate having you. And I'm going to turn it back to Cecilia to close us out.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Congressman Jeffries. Really appreciate your wisdom and your perspective, which we don't get every day. I do want to say, just as a plug for the foundation, that immigrant question on the census We were an early and pretty consistent funder of groups on the ground who were fighting that question and were plaintiffs on that case, which I think is just a great argument too for the structural change that we talk about, investing in organizers and advocates on the ground who are really winning this fight. And I think that that goes to how Aisha started us off, that politics is local ultimately, and investing locally is as important. Do both. Invest locally and tell 4 people you know in Pennsylvania to go and vote. So I think that it has to be a combination. And Aisha, to answer your question, you asked Hakim, and I'm going to answer it too, which is there's extraordinary work just happening right here in Brooklyn. And Hakim, I know you know there is. There are groups in your district that are really fighting the good fight, and they are at those food pantries that you are talking about, but they are also organizing and advocating. And we're just incredibly honored and proud to fund that work. But we can't fund it unless we get funded. So I'm gonna say that another thing you can do besides the 4 Friends in Pennsylvania is please consider donating to Brooklyn Community Foundation. We are really trying to do the best we can to spark justice in this borough. And I will end with that. And of course, with immense gratitude to our audience for showing up. Aisha, thank you. You're phenomenal. And Congressman Jeffries, thank you for carving out the time to do this. We are just honored and grateful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all the phenomenal work that you and the foundation do.
Thank you. All right, well, take care, and everybody take care of themselves. And hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. Please go to our website for the list of webinars coming up. It's very exciting. Thank you.